The spectacles slid down Lucinda Everhart's nose as she bent to light the stove in the one-room schoolhouse, and she pushed them back into place with a practiced finger, refusing to acknowledge the whispers that had followed her from the mercantile to the church steps to this dusty classroom on the Kansas prairie. San Elizario, Texas, had been her first choice, but when the letter came from Harmony Ridge offering better pay and a furnished room above the general store, she had packed her trunk and traveled north to this wind-scrubbed town where the horizon stretched endless in every direction, and people seemed to think a woman's mind should be just as flat and empty. The morning light filtered through windows she had scrubbed herself the previous afternoon. Casting golden squares across the wooden floor, she had swept 3 times to rid it of the dust that seemed determined to reclaim every human structure on the prairie. And she arranged the slate boards on each desk with the care of a general positioning troops before battle. The children would arrive within the hour, and Lucinda meant to be ready, meant to show this town that educated the value of a teacher who actually cared whether their sons could cipher beyond counting cattle, and their daughters could read beyond recipe cards. She adjusted the world map she had hung on the wall, one she had purchased with her own money in Chicago before the train carried her west, and traced the route she had traveled with one finger, marveling again at the distance between her childhood home in Pennsylvania and this place where the wind never seemed to stop talking. Her spectacles were a necessity, not an affectation, though the women at the boarding house where she had spent her first night had looked at them as though she wore a sign declaring herself unmarriageable, unnatural, unwomanly in her determination to see clearly. Let them whisper, she thought, straightening the books on her desk. She had not come west to catch a husband but to teach children who deserved better than ignorance dressed up as frontier practicality. The door swung open earlier than she expected, and Lucinda turned to find a man standing in the threshold with a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl, no more than 6, clinging to either side of him like burrs to a saddle blanket. The man was tall in the way of men who worked cattle, lean and weathered, with eyes the color of winter sky and a quietness that seemed to fill the room more thoroughly than noise ever could. He removed his hat with one hand, revealing hair the color of prairie wheat bleached by summer sun, and the gesture seemed both automatic and sincere, as though he had been raised by someone who taught manners and meant them to stick. "Miss Everhart," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the voice of someone who chose words the way other men chose tools, selecting only what was necessary and discarding the rest. "I am Killian Bryant. These are my children, Samuel and Margaret. They will be in your care most days." Lucinda smiled at the children, who stared at her with the solemn curiosity of young things encountering something new and possibly dangerous. "I am very pleased to meet you both," she said, crouching down to bring herself level with their eyes, ignoring the way her skirts pooled in the dust she had just swept away. "Can you tell me if you have been to school before?" The boy, Samuel, shook his head while his sister remained silent, one hand twisted in her father's trouser leg. Killian Bryant looked down at them with an expression Lucinda could not quite read, something tender and wounded all at once, and then he met her eyes with a directness that made her aware of how rarely men in this town actually looked at her face when they spoke to her. "Their mother taught them letters before she passed," he said, and the words came out flat, as though emotion had been deliberately pressed out of them like water from a shirt. "That was 2 years back. I have tried to keep it up, but I am no teacher, and the ranch does not leave much time for books." "Then we will continue what she started," Lucinda said gently, understanding now the shadows in both children's faces and the careful way their father held himself, as though one wrong move might shatter something already cracked. Learning is a gift that does not stop giving just because the giver is gone. Something shifted in Killian Bryant's expression, a slight softening around his eyes that might have been gratitude or relief or simply recognition that she understood what he had not quite said. He nodded once, squeezed each child's shoulder, and then turned to leave, pausing only when he reached the door to glance back at her with those winter sky eyes. "The town will talk," he said quietly, "about a woman in spectacles teaching their children. Do not let it trouble you overmuch." "I have never found that paying attention to gossip improved anything except the gossip's sense of importance," Lucinda replied, adjusting her spectacles as though to make a point, and she could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth twitch before he settled his hat back on his head and walked out into the morning. The schoolhouse filled quickly after that, children arriving in clusters and alone, some eager and some reluctant, some scrubbed clean and some still wearing yesterday's dirt like a second skin. Lucinda greeted each one by name, having memorized the roster the school board had grudgingly provided, and she set about the work of teaching with the focused energy of someone who knew she was being tested and refused to fail. By midday, she had assessed every child's reading level, started the older boys on geography, set the younger girls to practicing their letters, and managed to prevent 3 separate arguments over pencil ownership with a combination of fairness and humor that surprised even herself. Samuel and Margaret Bryant proved quick students, hungry for knowledge in a way that made Lucinda's heart ache with the thought of 2 years without proper schooling, and she made a mental note to prepare extra materials for them to take home. The days settled into a pattern that felt both exhausting and deeply satisfying, the rhythm of teaching filling Lucinda's hours with purpose, and her evenings with preparation for the next day. The town's whispers continued, of course, women clucking their tongues over the new schoolteacher's spectacles and unmarried state, as though the two were equally scandalous, men shaking their heads over the idea of a woman teaching their sons mathematics, and their daughters anything beyond housekeeping. Lucinda ignored them all with a determination that felt almost meditative, focusing instead on the children who arrived each morning ready to learn and left each afternoon with minds a little more open than they had been before. Killian Bryant came to collect his children every Friday, riding in from his ranch with a punctuality that Lucinda found oddly comforting in its reliability. He never said much, just nodded to her and listened as she reported on Samuel and Margaret's progress. But his attention was complete when she spoke, his eyes on her face with an intensity that made her aware of every word she chose. Other parents sent their children home alone or picked them up with barely a glance in her direction. But Killian Bryant always dismounted, always stepped inside, always asked if there was anything his children needed for their studies. "They are doing beautifully," Lucinda told him one October afternoon, as golden light slanted through the windows and painted everything the color of honey. "Samuel has a gift for numbers, and Margaret's reading has improved remarkably. Their mother must have given them an excellent foundation." "She believed education mattered," Killian said quietly, turning his hat in his hands with a restlessness that seemed at odds with his usual stillness. "Even out here, especially out here," she said. "She wanted them to have choices she never had." "Then I will do my best to honor that," Lucinda promised. And the look he gave her then was so full of something she could not name that she had to glance away, her heart beating faster than the moment seemed to warrant. The trouble started in November, when the first snow dusted the prairie, and the school board called a meeting to discuss the teacher's performance. Lucinda had expected some resistance, had prepared herself for criticism and suggestions disguised as helpful advice. But she had not anticipated the outright hostility from 3 of the 5 board members, men who seemed personally offended by her existence. Cyrus Welch, who owned the largest grain operation in the county, stood up and declared that the children were being filled with impractical nonsense when they should be learning skills useful for farm and ranch work. Herman Mills, the banker, worried aloud that too much education would make the girls unfit for marriage and the boys too proud for honest labor. Even Pastor Greenfield, who should have valued knowledge, hemmed and hawed about the propriety of an unmarried woman in spectacles serving as a moral example to impressionable youth. "I have taught these children reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography," Lucinda said, standing before the board with her spine straight and her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest. "I have maintained discipline without cruelty, encouraged curiosity without chaos, and treated every student with the respect they deserve as human beings capable of learning. If you find fault with any of that, please be specific so that I might address your concerns with facts rather than vague accusations." "It is not about fault," Cyrus Welch said, though his face suggested otherwise. "It is about what is appropriate for our community. We are simple people here, Miss Everhart. We do not need our children thinking they are too good for the lives their parents have built." "I have never suggested any such thing," Lucinda replied, her hands clenched at her sides to keep them from shaking. "I have simply offered them tools to build whatever lives they choose, whether that means staying here or going elsewhere, whether that means ranching or teaching or any of 1,000 other possibilities." "And therein lies the problem," Herman Mills interjected smoothly. "Filling their heads with possibilities when their futures are already determined by geography and circumstance. It is cruel, Miss Everhart, to make them want what they cannot have." The meeting ended without resolution, the board voting to table the discussion until January, and Lucinda walked back to her room above the general store feeling as though she had been in a fistfight rather than a bureaucratic skirmish. She wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, wanted to shake these men until they understood that education was not cruelty but the antidote to it. But instead she sat at her small desk and prepared the next week's lessons with shaking hands and fierce determination. Killian Bryant appeared at her door the following evening, hat in hand and snowflakes melting in his hair, and Lucinda answered his knock with surprise and a flutter of something she refused to examine too closely. "Mr. Bryant," she said, stepping back to let him into the tiny sitting area that served as both parlor and dining room. "Is something wrong with Samuel or Margaret?" "They are fine," he assured her quickly, then hesitated in a way that made him seem younger than his years, uncertain in a manner she had not seen from him before. "I heard about the school board meeting, about what Welch and Mills said." "News travels quickly in small towns," Lucinda said, trying for lightness and achieving something closer to bitterness. "It does," Killian agreed, turning his hat in his hands again with that restless energy. "I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with them. Some of us value what you are doing for our children. Some of us know that teaching them to think is not the same as teaching them to be dissatisfied." The words landed in Lucinda's chest like warmth on a cold day, unexpected and deeply welcome. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you might imagine." Killian looked at her then, really looked at her, his winter sky eyes moving over her face with an attention that made her suddenly conscious of her loosened hair and the informality of receiving a man in her private rooms. "They say a woman in spectacles will never marry," he said slowly, as though testing each word before releasing it. "They say it makes you look too smart, too independent, too much like something other than what a woman should be." Lucinda felt her spine stiffen, prepared for disappointment from this man whose opinion she had come to value more than was probably wise. "I wear them because I need them to see," she said flatly. "I did not realize clear vision was considered unfeminine." "It is not," Killian said, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "Smart looks good on you, Miss Everhart. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with things neither of them seemed ready to say, and Lucinda found herself unable to look away from his face, from the sincerity written in every weathered line and the warmth in eyes she had initially thought cold. "I will not," she managed finally. "Let them tell me otherwise, I mean. I have never been particularly good at listening to people who mistake ignorance for virtue." Killian smiled then, a real smile that transformed his whole face and made Lucinda's heart do something complicated in her chest. "I had a feeling about you," he said. "From the first morning, when you crouched down to talk to my children like they mattered. I thought, here is someone who sees clearly in more ways than one." He left shortly after, citing the cold and the ride back to his ranch. But the warmth of his words stayed with Lucinda through the long winter evening and into the weeks that followed. She caught herself watching for him on Fridays, anticipating his quiet arrivals and the brief conversations that felt increasingly important to her equilibrium. He began staying longer, asking more questions about the curriculum and less about his children specifically. And Lucinda began to understand that his interest extended beyond paternal concern into something altogether different and infinitely more complicated. December brought heavier snows and a renewed assault from the school board faction. Cyrus Welch circulating a petition to replace Lucinda with a male teacher from Topeka who would focus on practical skills and moral instruction. Lucinda watched the petition gather signatures with a sinking heart, knowing that many families genuinely believed they were protecting their children from dangerous ideas, when they were actually limiting possibilities that might never come again. She redoubled her efforts in the classroom, determined to teach as much as possible before they succeeded in removing her. And she pretended not to notice the way Samuel and Margaret Bryant watched her with worried eyes, as though they had already lost one important woman and could not bear to lose another. Killian came to her again on a Friday evening in mid-December, this time with a purpose written clearly in the set of his shoulders and the determination in his face. "I am organizing the ranch families," he said without preamble, standing in her doorway with snow swirling behind him and conviction in every word. "The ones whose children actually attend school and benefit from your teaching. We are going to the next board meeting, and we are going to make sure they understand that firing you means losing the support of half the families in this district." Lucinda felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built around the hope that anyone would fight for her the way she fought for the children. "You do not have to do that," she said, though she wanted desperately for him to do exactly that. "I knew this position might not last. I can find another school, another town." "I know you can," Killian said, stepping inside and closing the door against the cold, his eyes never leaving her face. "You could probably find a dozen schools in a dozen towns, places that would appreciate your skill and dedication. But I am asking you not to go. I am asking you to stay and let us stand with you, because Harmony Ridge needs you, and because my children need you, and because—" He stopped, the words seeming to tangle in his throat, and Lucinda waited with her heart hammering against her ribs and her breath shallow in her chest. "Because," she prompted softly. "Because I need you," Killian finished, the words coming out rough and honest and utterly without pretense. "I have needed you since that first morning when you promised to continue what my wife started, since you looked at my grieving children with kindness instead of pity, since you stood in front of that damned school board, and refuse to apologize for being exactly who you are. I am not good with words, Miss Everhart, but I know what I feel, and I feel that losing you would be a mistake I could not forgive myself for allowing. Lucinda stared at him, this quiet man who had just offered her more with his halting confession than a dozen poets could have managed with their prettiest verses. "I do not want to leave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to stay and teach these children and build something that lasts. And I want—" "What do you want?" Killian asked, moving closer, close enough that she could see the snowflakes still melting in his hair and the hope written plainly in his expression. "You," Lucinda said simply, the truth of it settling into her bones like something that had always been there waiting to be acknowledged. "I want you and Samuel and Margaret and this impossible town that does not know what to do with a woman in spectacles. I want to fight for the school and win, and I want to build a life here that matters." Killian reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished, and took her hand in his work-roughened one with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "Then we will fight together," he said. "And we will win together. And after that, if you are willing, we will build that life together." The school board meeting in January was unlike anything Harmony Ridge had seen in recent memory. The small room packed with ranch families who had ridden in through bitter cold to defend their children's teacher. Killian stood at the front with a dozen other fathers and mothers, and he spoke with more words than Lucinda had ever heard him use at once, laying out in plain terms how their children's reading had improved, how their mathematics had strengthened, how their understanding of the world had expanded under Miss Everhart's instruction. Other parents followed, some speaking eloquently, and others stumbling over their words, but all united in their insistence that removing the teacher would be removing the best thing that had happened to Harmony Ridge's school in years. Cyrus Welch tried to argue that book learning was not the same as practical wisdom, that filling children's heads with geography and history would not help them plant crops or raise cattle, but his words rang hollow against the testimony of parents who had watched their children blossom under Lucinda's care. Herman Mills attempted to raise concerns about propriety and the example set by an unmarried woman, but Killian cut him off with a quiet intensity that silenced the entire room. "Miss Everhart is the finest teacher these children have ever had," he said, his voice low but carrying easily in the sudden stillness. "She is dedicated, skilled, and genuinely cares about their futures. If you cannot see past her spectacles to recognize her value, then the failure is yours, not hers. And as for her unmarried state, I intend to remedy that situation if she will have me. So perhaps you could save your concerns about propriety for matters that actually warrant them." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and a few gasps, and Lucinda felt her face flame even as her heart soared with a joy so sharp it was almost painful. Killian glanced back at her with a small smile, and she nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak for them both, giving him everything he had just asked for and more besides. The board voted 4-1 to retain Miss Everhart for the remainder of the school year, and to offer her a contract for the following year as well. Cyrus Welch the sole dissenting voice in a decision that felt like vindication and victory all wrapped together. Lucinda accepted with as much dignity as she could muster while her hands shook and her eyes threatened to overflow, and she thanked the families who had stood with her, knowing that their support had made all the difference between staying and leaving, between building and abandoning, between love and loneliness. Killian walked her back to her rooms through snow that fell soft and steady, transforming the prairie into something clean and new, and they did not speak until they reached her door and turned to face each other in the yellow glow of the lamplight spilling from her window. "I meant what I said in there," he told her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "About wanting to marry you, about building a life together. I know it is fast, and I know you have your teaching to consider, but I have been alone long enough to recognize something real when I find it." "It is real," Lucinda agreed, reaching up to touch his face with wonder, marveling at the fact that this strong, quiet man had chosen her, spectacles and stubbornness and all. "And I want you and your children and whatever future we can make together." "I will not give up teaching, Killian. I cannot." "I would never ask you to," he said seriously, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "My children need you as a teacher, and so do all the others. We will make it work, Lucinda. I will bring Samuel and Margaret to school every day if I have to, and I will pick them up every afternoon, and we will fill our home with books and learning and love enough for all of us." They married in March, when the prairie began to green and the wind carried the scent of growing things instead of snow, and Lucinda wore her spectacles to the ceremony without a moment's hesitation. She stood beside Killian in the small church with Samuel and Margaret watching solemnly from the front pew, and she promised to love and honor this man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, who had valued her mind as much as her heart, who had stood beside her when others would have let her fall. Killian's vows were simple and sincere, spoken in that careful voice she had come to love, and when he kissed her at the minister's instruction, she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like something she had been missing without knowing it. They merged their lives with surprising ease, Lucinda moving into the ranch house with its wide porch and distant views, filling the empty spaces with her books and teaching materials, and the warmth of her presence. Samuel and Margaret adapted quickly to having a new mother, though Lucinda was careful never to try replacing the woman who had given them life, instead offering a different kind of love that honored what had come before, while building something new. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse, riding in with Killian each morning and returning each evening to a home that felt more real than anywhere she had lived before. And she discovered that it was possible to be both a wife and a teacher, both a mother and an individual, both soft and strong all at once. The town's whispers faded gradually, replaced by a grudging respect for the woman who had refused to compromise her principles or her vision, who had fought for their children's education, and one who wore her spectacles with pride and taught their sons and daughters to value knowledge over ignorance. Lucinda heard that Cyrus Welch still grumbled about impractical book learning, that Herman Mills still worried about girls getting ideas above their station. But their complaints carried less weight now, drowned out by the voices of parents who had seen their children thrive under her instruction. The seasons turned and turned again, spring into summer into autumn into winter, the prairie cycling through its endless transformations while Lucinda taught and Killian ranched, and their blended family grew in love and understanding. Samuel developed into a serious boy with his father's quiet intensity, and a gift for mathematics that Lucinda nurtured carefully, knowing he might one day choose to be more than a rancher if he wished. Margaret blossomed into a voracious reader who devoured every book Lucinda could find for her, her imagination as vast as the prairie sky and twice as beautiful. In their second year of marriage, Lucinda discovered she was carrying a child, and the joy that filled her was matched only by Killian's quiet wonder and the excited anticipation of Samuel and Margaret, who had never had a sibling and seemed thrilled at the prospect. The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Lucinda's determination to keep teaching until she absolutely could not, and Killian learned to accept that his wife was as stubborn as she was brilliant, as independent as she was loving, as unwilling to be confined by expectations as she had been the day he first saw her push her spectacles back into place and refuse to acknowledge the whispers. Their daughter arrived in April, small and perfect and loudly opinionated from her first breath, and they named her Adelheid after Killian's grandmother, a woman who had reportedly been just as determined and unconventional as the granddaughter-in-law she would never meet. Lucinda took only 6 weeks away from teaching, arranging for a substitute from a neighboring town, and spending the time marveling at the tiny person she and Killian had created together. At the way, Samuel and Margaret doted on their baby sister with a tenderness that made her heart ache with gratitude. Returning to the schoolhouse felt both strange and necessary, her identity expanding to hold teacher and wife and mother all at once, refusing to diminish any part of herself to accommodate the others. Adelheid was barely walking when Lucinda found herself pregnant again, and this time Killian laughed at her insistence that she could teach until the very end, though he supported her anyway, because he had learned that loving Lucinda meant accepting all of her, spectacles and stubbornness and brilliant, beautiful mind included. Their son arrived in February, born during a blizzard that trapped them in the ranch house for 3 days and made Lucinda grateful for Killian's steady presence, and the midwife who had agreed to stay through the storm. They named him Percival, a name Lucinda had always loved for its literary connections, and he proved to be a quieter baby than his sister, content to watch the world with serious eyes that reminded her of his father. The schoolhouse thrived under Lucinda's continued guidance, the children of Harmony Ridge receiving an education that prepared them for whatever futures they chose to build, whether that meant staying on the prairie or seeking opportunities elsewhere. Some of her students went on to normal schools and universities, carrying with them the foundation she had given them and writing letters that made her cry with pride. Others stayed in the community and raised families of their own, but they did so with minds opened by learning and hearts enlarged by the understanding that education was a gift, not a threat. Samuel grew into a young man who surprised everyone by choosing to study engineering, his mathematical gift too strong to be satisfied by ranching alone, and Lucinda helped him apply to schools back east with a mother's pride and a teacher's satisfaction. Margaret announced her intention to become a teacher herself, inspired by the woman who had become her stepmother, and shown her that intelligence was something to celebrate rather than hide. And Lucinda spent hours helping her prepare for the examinations that would determine her future. Adelheid and Percival grew up in a house filled with love and books and the constant hum of intellectual curiosity, their mother teaching them their letters before they could properly walk, and their father showing them the practical skills of ranch life with patience and care. They attended their mother's school when they were old enough, sitting among the other children and learning that knowledge was for everyone, not just for people who looked a certain way or came from certain families or fit into narrow definitions of what was acceptable and appropriate. Killian remained the quiet, steady presence he had always been, a man of few words but deep feeling, and his love for Lucinda never wavered or dimmed with the passage of years. He still told her that smart looked good on her, still defended her right to teach against the occasional grumbling from those who thought a mother's place was exclusively in the home, still looked at her with winter sky eyes full of warmth and wonder as though he could not quite believe his fortune in finding her. Lucinda taught for 30 years in that one-room schoolhouse on the Kansas prairie, wearing her spectacles without apology or hesitation, educating generations of children who carried her influence out into the world like seeds scattered on the wind. She watched the town change around her, saw attitudes shift as the students she had taught became parents themselves and demanded good education for their own children, witnessed the gradual acceptance that a woman could be intelligent and useful and valued for her mind as much as anything else. When she finally retired, it was not because anyone pushed her out or because she had lost her passion for teaching, but because she wanted time to travel with Killian, to visit Samuel in Chicago, where he worked as a bridge engineer, to help Margaret establish her own school in Colorado, to spoil Adelaide's children and Percival's future family with the privilege of age and accumulated wisdom. The schoolhouse threw her a celebration that brought former students from across the state, men and women who credited her with changing their lives, opening their minds, giving them the tools to build futures they had never imagined possible. Killian stood beside her through it all, his hand warm and solid in hers, and when someone made a speech about the courageous teacher who had worn her spectacles despite the whispers and changed Harmony Ridge forever, he leaned close and whispered in her ear, "Smart still looks good on you." Lucinda laughed and squeezed his hand, thinking about the long road they had traveled together from that first morning when he had brought his grieving children to her classroom, and she had promised to continue what their mother had started. She had kept that promise and so many others, building a life that honored education and love equally, refusing to choose between being a teacher and being a wife and mother, insisting that she could be all of those things and more besides. The prairie wind carried the scent of growing things as they walked home that evening, their hands linked and their steps matching after decades of walking together. 4 children, hundreds of students, countless battles fought and won, and through it all the constant, steady love of a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning and chosen her not despite her intelligence but because of it. Lucinda adjusted her spectacles, a gesture so habitual she barely noticed it anymore, and looked out at the prairie stretching endless in every direction, golden in the evening light and beautiful beyond measure. "You ever regret it?" Killian asked quietly, reading her contemplative mood with the ease of long familiarity. "Coming here, fighting so hard for the school, staying when you could have gone somewhere easier." Lucinda considered the question seriously, thinking about the struggles and the triumphs, the whispers and the victories, the moments of doubt and the overwhelming certainty that she had chosen rightly. "Not for a single moment," she said finally, turning to look at the man who had stood beside her through everything, who had loved her exactly as she was and helped her become even more. "This is where I was meant to be. With you, with our children, with all those students who needed someone to believe in their potential. I would not change any of it." "Good," Killian said, pulling her close with the confidence of a man who knew he was welcome, who had earned the right to hold her through years of partnership and devotion. "Because I cannot imagine my life without you in it, spectacles and all." They stood together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose and violet. 2 people who had found each other against the odds and built something lasting in a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the prairie stretched on forever. Behind them, the schoolhouse stood quiet and empty, waiting for the new teacher who would take Lucinda's place and carry on the work she had started, educating the next generation of children who deserve to see clearly and think deeply and dream widely. Ahead of them, the ranch house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming, a home they had filled with love and learning and the laughter of children who had grown up knowing that intelligence was a gift, that education mattered, that a woman in spectacles could change the world simply by refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose. Lucinda adjusted her spectacles one more time, a gesture of defiance and pride and simple practicality, and walked toward that light with Killian at her side, content in the knowledge that she had lived fully and loved deeply, and made a difference that would outlast her own lifetime. Years later, when their grandchildren asked about the spectacles Lucinda still wore with such determination, about the whispers that had once followed her through town, about the courage it had taken to stand firm against those who wanted her gone. Killian would smile his quiet smile and say the same thing he had said that evening in her tiny rooms above the general store, the words that had changed everything between them. "Smart looks good on her," he would tell them, his winter sky eyes still full of warmth when they rested on his wife's face. "It always has, and it always will. Do not ever let anyone convince you that being intelligent is something to hide or apologize for. Your grandmother taught me that, and she taught this whole town, and now we are teaching you." And Lucinda would adjust her spectacles and add her own wisdom, born of decades of teaching and loving and living fully in a world that had tried to make her smaller and failed spectacularly. "See clearly," she would tell them, her voice still strong even as her hair silvered and her hands grew gnarled with age. "Think deeply. Question constantly. Learn voraciously. And never, ever let anyone convince you that you should make yourself less to make others more comfortable. The world needs people who see clearly, who think for themselves, who refuse to accept that things must stay as they have always been." The children would nod solemnly, absorbing these lessons the way children do when they know they are receiving something precious, something earned through struggle and sacrifice, and the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. They would grow up carrying these teachings forward into their own lives, spreading the influence of a woman who had worn her spectacles, despite the whispers, and changed not just a town but the trajectory of countless lives simply by insisting on her right to see clearly and think deeply and be exactly who she was. On quiet evenings, Lucinda and Killian would sit on their porch and watch the prairie sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, and they would hold hands with the comfortable ease of people who had chosen each other every single day for decades, and never once regretted that choice. The spectacles still perched on Lucinda's nose, a little more scratched now, replaced twice over the years but always present, always necessary, always a symbol of everything she had fought for and won. "I love you," Killian would say, the words coming easier after years of practice, but no less meaningful for their frequency. "I love you too," Lucinda would reply, squeezing his hand and thinking about the impossible, beautiful life they had built together, about 4 children who had grown into remarkable adults, about hundreds of students who had carried her teachings out into the world, about a quiet man who had fallen in love with her mind as much as her heart, and told her that smart looked good on her when the rest of the world thought her spectacles made her unmarriageable. The wind would carry the scent of prairie grass and distant rain, and somewhere in the house their grandchildren would be reading books from the extensive library Lucinda had accumulated over the years, their young voices stumbling over difficult words and then triumphantly conquering them, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who had believed that education mattered and love was possible, and spectacles were nothing to be ashamed of. This was the life Lucinda Everhart Bryant had chosen, the life she had fought for, the life she had built with stubbornness and intelligence, and the unwavering support of a man who had seen her clearly from the very beginning. It was a good life, a full life, a life that had made a difference in ways both large and small, and she would not have traded a single moment of it for all the easier paths she might have taken. The spectacles stayed firmly on her nose where they belonged, and the whispers that had once followed her had long since transformed into stories told with admiration and pride. Smart had looked good on her then, and it looked good on her still, and the love she and Killian had built together had proven stronger than gossip, deeper than doubt, and more enduring than any of the forces that had tried to tear them apart. As darkness settled over the prairie, and the stars emerged one by one in the vast Kansas sky, Lucinda adjusted her spectacles one final time and leaned her head against Killian's shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had lived according to her own principles, loved without reservation, and taught generations of children to see clearly and think for themselves. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.